how long? But I want some now. Oh, hello. Tonight's episode is for anybody who's ever left food sitting out for an extended period of time and then wondered, is this okay to eat? Yes, tonight we're making pickles. Now, the discovery of pickled cucumbers, or pickles as we call them in North America, happened long ago, when a poor farmer who lived and worked in a secluded valley was struggling to make ends meet. One spring, on his way to the market, he was accosted by a fast-talking con man who convinced him to buy hundreds of packets of cucumber seeds. Convinced by the man that the fruit was thoroughly delicious and would be immensely popular, the farmer planted his entire farm with cucumbers, save for a small patch near the house that he saved for an herb garden. The weeks went by, the vines grew, and the farm was thick with cucumbers. When they were finally ready to pick, the farmer plucked one from the vine and ate it on the spot. When he discovered how bland and flavorless they were, he wept uncontrollably. So great was his grief at discovering that he had been duped, he filled the valley with his tears, flooding his farm. It was quite a pickle. The flood of tears did not recede for weeks. But once it did, the farmer was left with fields of salty, waterlogged cucumbers, and no idea what to do with them. Having run out of stored food, and having no other crops with which to feed himself that season, the farmer gathered a bushel of cucumbers for his dinner that night. He brought them inside, and made a plain salad with the cucumbers and nothing else. To his surprise and delight, they were absolutely delicious, and he was able to sell them in jars at a considerable profit and retire to the tropics. Now you can buy store-bought pickles, which are often made with vinegar and are usually fairly flavorless, or you can make your own at home. It's easy. No tears necessary. I'll show you how.
Firstly, I would be, at the very least, rude if I made this video without mentioning the book Wild Fermentation by Sandor Alex Katz. I don't usually follow his instructions exactly, and I'm not doing that here, but his book is always an invaluable guide in all of my fermentation projects. This is not an advertisement, rather it is an acknowledgement of what I have found to be a very useful book. I'm using a 3-gallon crock specifically designed for this purpose, but you can use a food-grade bucket, the crock from a crock pot, or a similar container, just as long as it's not made of metal, as it could chemically react with the fermenting contents. I would have preferred to start with more garlic than this, but this is what I had on hand. You can use any kind of dill, fresh, dry, or seed. I didn't have quite enough fresh dill on hand, so I'm using some of each kind. I'm also using brown mustard seed and small red peppers called japones, just a few because they're pretty spicy. You can use practically any kind of salt, but I'm using sea salt for this. It has been said that salt containing iodine has an inhibitive effect on the growth of the lacto-bacilli. Making sure, of course, that your crock is nice and clean first, go ahead and throw the spices in. Over the weeks, I would go on to remove pickles and add fresh cucumbers, along with more spices, including several more heads of garlic, more dill, a few more peppers, grains of paradise, and whole black peppercorns. Now you can either just throw in a whole sprig of dill, or you can snip it up like this. It doesn't really make much of a difference. Now, the first batch of pickles I made were very good. The only complaint I have about them is, as you can see, they could have been more heavily spiced. It is, however, a matter of taste. You can make pickles out of practically any kind of cucumber, either store-bought or homegrown. Big ones like this, the size of your forearm, or little gnarly ones the size of a thumb. Just go ahead and place them all into the crock with the spices. Keep in mind that the small ones will probably be ready sooner than the large ones. Now, if it's been more than a few hours since you picked the cucumbers, or if you're using store-bought ones, you might want to soak them in cold water for a while to perk them up, and of course, in either case, you'll want to wash them well before putting them into the crock. You can vary the amount of salt that you use based on personal preference and the local climate. Generally, in summer you want to use more, in winter you want to use less. I'm making these in the summertime, and I'm using about 3 tablespoons of salt per liter of water, starting with 2 liters of water. Mix them together thoroughly until the salt is dissolved. Pour the salt water over the cucumbers and spices until they are well covered. If you need some more, just mix it at the same ratios. If you think you have too much, don't worry about it. It's better to have too much than too little, and some will inevitably evaporate in any case. Now we just need to find something to hold them down under the brine with. Stores that sell crocks usually also sell circular wooden boards for this purpose, but I usually just use whatever I can find around the house. I thought that a dinner plate would work, but all of mine were slightly too large, so I ended up using the lid of a casserole dish. Whatever you use, just make sure that it's quite clean. You might even put it through the dishwasher or boil it to sterilize it first. Place it over the pickles and place a weight on top. In this case, I'm using a jar filled with water, also cleaned and sterilized. Add more salt water if you need to bring it up over the level of the cover. Cover the crock with something such as a towel or cheesecloth to keep out dust and flies. Keep it in place with a rubber band or a length of string, or, as I'm doing here, a length of yarn. If you like, you can make a pretty bow. You want to check on the pickles every day. Scum will start forming on the top. At first it will be a bit frothy like this, and you might want to skim a little bit of it from around the edges. This is fairly easy to do with a spoon. After a few days, you'll probably start noticing spots of mold, like these. These can also be easily skimmed off with a spoon. Well, that's not too bad. I mean, it's just a few little spots on the surface. It's not like really gross or disgusting. Ah! Well, this can also be skimmed off with a spoon, and you probably won't be able to get all of it. Don't worry about the pickles. As long as they're under a fair amount of brine, they'll be fine. This is only on the surface. However, every time this happens, if there's a fair amount of scum, you'll want to take out both the cover and the weight and rinse them off thoroughly. When you do this, also make sure that the level of the brine is high enough and add more as necessary. It's important when you're making a ferment to have both patience and vigilance. You can taste them every day if you like, but you might want to taste the pickles every few days to notice how the flavor changes over time. They won't really be pickles until after about a week, and they could take up to 4 weeks to reach full maturity. If they sit in the crock for too long, however, they will start to go downhill and eventually turn to mush. Now, we're not going to be heat processing these, but you can use canning jars, or you can just use jars left over from pasta sauce or the like. You'll also need a pair of tongs, or you can just use your bare hands. After a week or two, or whenever you think they're ready, clean and sterilize your jars. As I mentioned before, the smaller ones will be ready before the larger ones, but they'll all be ready eventually. Now, depending on the size of your jars, you might have to play pickle Tetris a little bit to fit them all in. Go ahead and throw in some of the brined garlic and other spices as well. Get a ladle. Spoon enough brine from the crock into the jar to cover the pickles. If you don't feel you have enough brine, or if it's a bit salty and you want to dilute it, you can use some brine and the rest water. Try to scrape some of the spices from the bottom and put those in the jar as well. Once that's done, screw the lid on tight, wipe off any excess brine, and move the jar to the fridge, where as long as there's enough brine to cover the pickles, they should keep for several months. As you can see, it's normal for the brine to be cloudy. If you like, you can also slice the pickles or cut them into spears before placing them in the jars.
Boy oh boy, that was easy, and these pickles are great. Tune in next time for information on something else.